Hi everyone, my name is Ali Reza. I'm from Flavours of Light, and today I'm thrilled to be here with Tony Wright, consciousness researcher and author of Return to the Brain of Eden. Tony, thank you for being here today. My first question is, for those who are not familiar with your work, could you highlight what your research is about and what you have discovered?
Well, that's a big question. I'll try and answer that. I'm basically investigating or researching human origins, where our ancestors came from and how that journey's brought us to where we are, and particularly how our neural system, our perceptual system, our brain evolved and how it developed. And particularly, I suppose my main area of interest is whether there's a serious problem with our brain. And my tentative conclusions are exactly that. I think we have a very serious problem with our neural system, and I think that's echoed in the ancestral traditions. So I'm really trying to kind of quantify that and make sense of it and put it in a format that we can understand.
Many people strongly affirm that we originated from caves. What does science say about our origins?
Well, there's quite a lot of views, but I suppose the general consensus view is that we certainly did live in the forest for a very long time, but most of the interest in mainstream thinking has gone into what happened when we left the forest. There's a general view that things didn't get interesting till we left the forest, till we got into hostile environments like the classic savanna idea, and that somehow shaped and formed our physiology, in particular our brain, as we came into more challenging environments. So that's where a lot of focus has been, basically, not so much in the forest, more in the savannas and the hostile environments and what we had to overcome and how that might have affected the evolution of our brain.
Clearly looking around, we are not in the Edenic biological eco-niche that our origins display. We are living in quite hostile environments, London being a good example. Your previous book title described our current experience as being left in the dark. Some also refer to this as the Dark Ages. What has gone wrong?
Basically, we have a serious problem with our brain. We have serious mental health problems that are so bad we don't know we have them. And inevitably, with serious mental health, we create the world in our image. So when you're talking about dark ages or dark places, I mean, I would agree. I think we've created some of the most horrendous, hell-like societies that didn't exist till we created them.
That's true.
And we mistake them for normal now. So certainly massive conurbations, massive cities, where some people spend their whole lives. It's about as far removed from our biological origins as you can get, and stressful in its own right. So I think we have mental health problems, and then we're making them worse by the very societies we create.
I think just going from my experience, just going to the tropics and coming back to London, you can see and feel the shift in your reality, and I think it's a clear display of that being true. But what do you think was the exact cause of that? What is the root cause of this? Because our brain is damaged. We're far disconnected from Mother Nature, if we want to call it that. But what would you say the underlying cause is of that damage?
Well, you mentioned the forest and Mother Nature, and I in simple language, we have become disconnected, and I don't mean that in a philosophical sense. I actually mean in a very physical sense. As far as I can tell, our origins were forest dwelling, and more than that, we had a very special relationship with the forest, what's called a symbiotic relationship, where we were seed disseminators in the forest. And this is the flowering plants. The forest is very good at kidnapping all sorts of species, whether it's insects for pollination, bats for pollination, or primates for seed dissemination. And part of that deal is you get something in return. And over time, symbiotic relationships can become very, very close. It's almost difficult to tell which species is which. They become so entangled. And I think our relationship was particularly unusual, ours and some of our relatives, in that we were ingesting the reproductive organs of the flowering plants of the forest. So you think the reproductive organs are sex organs, very specialised. That was flooding our system for a long, long time. And I think that, for reasons that are a little bit more complicated, but that allowed us to grow a brand new brain, very different kind of brain. It worked in a very different way. And then at some point, probably repeated times, the forest has shrunk, sometimes disappeared, and there's been waves of forest refugees that have gone on, some of them to survive, but without this special relationship, our brain has become basically more degenerate, and we've ended up with these extremely dysfunctional mental health problems, and therefore we've ended up basically creating the world in the image of our current state of mind, which is very, very dysfunctional.
What are the implications of the fall of mankind?
The implications are horrendous. We've turned all the information we have is that currently, as far as we know, this is a paradisical speck in a vast, infinite ocean of bleakness. This tiny little ball that we inhabit, and it provided us with everything we needed because we've been here for so long, depending on your belief system, tens of millions of years, and overnight we've trashed it. We've turned it into a garbage heap, and we've created the most insane devices to kill each other. These are some of the consequences I think of. We basically turned paradise into hell, and we've done it very quickly, and we don't even recognise what we're doing.
And what is the implications of having a brain controlled by the left hemisphere?
It's a good question, and again, there's a lot could be said on that, and I'm going to mention Dr. Ian McGilchrist. I think he has a very good take on this. I'll certainly chip in, but I think if anybody wants to look into that and get a good handle on it, check out Ian McGilchrist's work, The Master and His Emissary. He's done a very good job of putting that in context. I actually think it's worse than he suggests, but I think it's a very good place to start, in that basically the left side of our brain has become more primitive, and it has lost a lot of abilities, and it increasingly sees the world in a very mechanistic way, and tries again to create the world in its own image, and it tends to value inanimate objects over biological systems. We tend to be more interested in our smartphone than the person next to us, and so on. And I think there's a whole raft of problems, but again, if in the simplistic sense, you take a hectare of tropical forest and the phenomenal diversity in patterns, and it's beyond our capacity to begin to approach creating something like that. We cut that down, we build a big block of concrete. I mean, that kind of sums it up for me. Probably with some nuclear power station to fuel it. That's what we've done. That's what the left brain thinks is very advanced, and it's got it completely back to front. It's insane.
And this is the side of the brain that you, me, everybody in their day-to-day lives is operating on.
Well, there's quite a lot of data on this, and quite a lot of varying opinions, but there's certainly good evidence that it provides us with our day-to-day sense of self. It's not the whole picture, but the kind of that surface self, that sense of self we're familiar with when we exchange with each other, almost that veneer we've created, because most people, certainly in our culture, we create like almost an avatar. It's who we'll interact with. We don't really let people see who we really are for the most part, and that's kind of our left brain trying to create an image that it thinks is appropriate or acceptable. It's got nothing to do with reality, but that's how it operates. And yes, it plays a big role in that. I can't say that we're exclusively one hemisphere or another, because that's not the case at all. But in terms of what makes it through to our perception, that is dominated by our left hemisphere. I mean, if you think of speech is particularly associated with the left brain. And most of us live in a world constructed around speech. And most of us have an incessant voice in our heads coming out with all sorts of crazy stuff that we probably wouldn't want to share with our closest friends, let alone anyone else. But it's always building these worlds and words and concepts. That's your left brain.
Tony, would you say that what we eat directly impacts everything in our day-to-day life, from our consciousness, our actions, our behavior, thoughts, health, state of being?
Absolutely, and without doubt. In fact, it would be disturbing to think it didn't. I view this, or at least one way to look at it is an engineering perspective, and basically you're looking at the sort of construction materials, the fuel, and even the design components, because diet can affect, you know, how things develop and so on. So if you change those parameters in any complex system, it's going to have a big impact. So yeah, it has a massive effect. Although it's not so easy to see, I think, because our culture in particular eats so badly that there's not much variation. The kind of reference points are all pretty low. But there've been some interesting studies. I mean, there've been studies, for example, on prison populations, where some enlightened thinkers have thought, well, maybe if we change the diet and improve the diet, it might affect reoffending rates and so on. Well, what do you know? It's hardly surprising. It's more surprising that more of this work hasn't been done. Or schools, I think there's that classic case that was on a well-known documentary years ago, where I think there was a high school in the US that was a hub for challenged kids, like kids that were a bit more difficult, at least that's how they were perceived. And from what I remember, they took out all the junk food, put a lot of fresh food in, and a lot of simple, simply prepared food, and the difference was astounding. And again, it's astounding that people are astounded by that. I mean, why wouldn't it make a huge difference? So yes, I think again, instead of calling it food, the stuff we build ourselves from and build and run our brain on, of course, is going to have a massive impact.
Going back to our origins, what was our relationship to the forest and the tropical flowering plants in particular?
Basically, we spent the vast majority of our past in the forest, tens of millions of years, 60 million years plus, and we had a very special relationship with the forest and the flowering plants. The flowering plants are pretty cool. They basically co-opted and kidnapped many species for their own needs, usually part of their sexual reproduction. The obvious one would be insects and pollination. You know, the insects carry out some of the sexual reproduction, and in return they get some nectar or some pollen. Well, primates for the most part have also been co-opted into that relationship. Not so much pollination, although a little bit of that still goes on, but more seed dissemination. So we've been drawn in to basically carry the seeds away from the parent plants, so they've got a chance to germinate somewhere else, and probably with some built-in manure. That's how these things work. So it's a very good system for the plants, and we got the ultimate free lunch, because there's not much free in nature. Most things don't want to be eaten, very, very heavily defended mechanically or chemically or whatever, whereas the plant reproductive organs, fruit, for the most part, for most species, you know, it's designed to be eaten. So that was our relationship. We were an integral part of the plant's reproductive system, and these relationships are called symbiotic relationships, and over long periods of time the boundaries can blur between what's usually called the host and the symbiont. A good example would be there are species of insect that have been honed so much by the flower and vice versa that the two things lock perfectly, very odd shape. And if one dies, the other dies, because they're so codependent. So that's the kind of relationship I think we had, particularly I think with our brain. I think actually our new brain, the big neocortex, was a byproduct of that relationship.
And we're not talking about any forest. Is there a particular type of forest we're describing here?
Yes, I think particularly I'm particularly interested in the forest ecology that can provide this relationship 24/7 for evolutionary timescales, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. And the only niche that can do that is what's called the non-seasonal tropical rainforests, basically right on or more or less very close to the equator. So there's no real change in day length, very little change in day length, very little change in climate or weather. Basically the same. And if you think most plants that most people are familiar with, they have seasons. They have a flowering season, a fruiting season. Well, in these small niches, there isn't a season, so you can get trees in all stages of development all the time. So there's basically fruit available all the time. And that's the only place it has a major evolutionary impact, at least in what I'm proposing. And those niches do exist. They vary depending on the climate. They can expand if it's wet and warm, and they can shrink if it's drier and cooler. And in principle, they can disappear altogether, which I think may have happened on occasion.
Are they still present today, these non-seasonal tropical forests?
Yes, yes. I mean, again, it depends on the big cycles of the global climate. But yes, you can find these niches again on the equator, where there's sufficient rainfall. So there's got to be enough rainfall to create a rainforest. So you'd be thinking parts of equatorial West Africa, the Amazon, but more on the east side, Borneo, Southeast Asia. I'm not sure if Australia would be quite in there, but more sort of Southeast Asia. So yes, there are still those niches that, in fact, they've always been there. As I say, they just expand or shrink, and in some places they can disappear if it gets dry enough and the forest dries out.
You discussed our symbiotic relationship to be with the reproductive organ of a flowering plant, and this you labelled as what we call today fruit. What is fruit exactly?
You've hit the nail on the head. It's in a botanical sense. I mean, most of us have grown up with fruit as something you eat. It's a snack, or maybe you don't eat because you don't like fruit or whatever. But that's kind of become ingrained in our conditioned sort of ideas. Oh, well, it's just fruit. But actually, it's a very complex organ, and it's evolved to. It's like the equivalent of the mammalian uterus. So the reproductive organ has evolved to provide just the right environment for embryonic seed development and embryonic plant development. So you think seeds are embryonic plants, so like highly compressed plants. You add water, they expand, magic. Well, that's the environment that's provided for their development. Now, in symbiotic relationships, that reproductive organ can swell because the plant's trying to. When I say trying, I'm not saying consciously, but over time and through selection, this is what happens, that the plant's trying to attract seed disseminators. So the plants that produce the most tempting reproductive organs are going to do more trade. So not surprisingly, they swell, they colour up, but they're stuck with using reproductive biochemistry because it's still a reproductive organ, even if it's 100 times bigger than it was millions of years ago. So basically, fruit is a reproductive organ. Think, as I say, the mammalian uterus, and that's what we had a relationship. That's what we were eating for millions of years. Reproductive organs. Kind of weird if you really think about it, because we're kind of sort of used to the idea. But if you were to think, okay, maybe we evolved on the savannah, and our specialist diet was the sex organs of the wildebeest, we'd be like, what the hell? That's really weird. But actually, it's even more weird because this is a kingdom further removed with very different biochemistry. But very interesting relationship with the reproductive organs of the angiosperms.
Some would label this in the present day as a raw vegan fruit-based diet. What impact does it have living on a raw vegan fruit-based diet on human development? Both physiologically and psychologically.
Well, I think there's multiple layers to this, and the first thing I'd have to say is it depends on your current state. I think humans currently we're in quite poor shape, and we're very, very different to our ancestral days of living in the forest. A lot of things have changed, and I think it's important to realise that. So I think it's by degrees, depending on how healthy you are in your system, your gut flora, your neuro assimilation system. But generally, if your body's able to work with it, it really seems to be the closest we can get to providing the biochemistry that our brain once ran on. So I think it can have a very big impact on our perception and our psychology. And there's certainly plenty of evidence, again, as long as you understand what you're doing, and it's what can we call it, a very nutritionally rich diet, because any diet's no good if you don't know what you're doing and it's not nutritionally sound. But culturally, we've seen a lot of interest in veganism. Some of it's junk food, and people don't do so well. But people who really do their homework, you're starting to see vegan athletes starting to come through, and disproportionately, considering percentage of vegan athletes. Some of them are doing exceptionally well. So clearly, if you get it right, it's a phenomenal combination. But I do emphasise you have to know what you're doing.
What is your view currently on Western nutrition, which glorifies fallback foods such as non-human plant foods, grains, meat, at the same time putting fear into people regarding eating too much fruit because it has too much sugar?
I think Western diet is a catastrophe, and that's an understatement. It would be hard to dream up a more inappropriate combination of substances to build one of the most advanced consciousness systems, perceptual systems we know. It is like building, again, it's a crude analogy, it's like taking a hand-built Italian car and building it from polystyrene and cardboard. That's kind of what we've done to our brain and our body. So, and the evidence is clear. We're drowning in a sea of degenerative disease, and we kind of almost accept it. And that's part of our mental health problems. You know, we're physically getting sicker and sicker by the year almost. You know, we've run out of names for all the diseases we've got. It's insane.
That's true.
And yet we're quite happy to go along to the doctors and get some tablets as if somehow that's going to fix everything. So yeah, utter disaster, in my opinion. What was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, it was just one question, but I just want to know your view on the Western nutrition. We're glorifying fallback foods such as non-human plant foods, and grains being an example, meat at the same time putting fear into people about too much sugar
that was it,
related to fruit. So we've been encouraged to limit fruit consumption intake.
Well, so back to your first point, if it was just fallback foods, traditional primate fallback foods, that wouldn't be so bad. I mean, it wouldn't be optimum, but if it was just roots, tubers, and the kind of things primates eat when fruit isn't in season, we'd be an awful lot healthier than we are now. But it's not just fallback foods. It's what you're saying and a lot worse, and processed junk stuff. It's got nothing to do with biology, let alone food. So I'm amazed we're still alive. I think it's a measure of how phenomenal our system originally was, that we've tolerated this self-abuse. But in terms of sugar, and yes, the fear around sugar, I think there's lots of influences. There's commercial interests and basically poor science. Having said that, I think there are reasons to be very cautious, certainly around processed sugar, refined sugar, unbuffered sugar. But I'd even go as far, bearing in mind we're talking a lot about fruit, in our current state, I think even starting on a fruit diet, I think you have to take steps for most people, because our system's in such a mess, and sugar is undoubtedly, it's like a high octane rocket fuel, and when you burn sugar, when you burn anything that's an oxidizing process, it produces free radicals. It basically heats up and causes problems. In our ancestral past, it was a very controlled environment. The sugar was delivered it was basically an integral part of the fibre and the fruit, so it was slow release. On top of that, what came with the sugar were layers of protection that protected the brain, so antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, they all came as part of the same package. So as our brain expanded, it needed a lot of sugar, but it was being delivered in an incredibly safe way. Now, of course, we've lost all the protection. We don't have the anti-inflammatories, we don't have the antioxidants. Our brain is even in poor shape before we start. It's built from oxidized fats and so on. And then on top of that, we're pouring in totally unbuffered sugar. So it's like your engine's overheated and then you're pouring petrol on it, when it's supposed to be a very controlled burn with the coolants there and the oils there. Well, that's like it's all gone. So I think there is reason to be cautious around sugar, but we've got totally the wrong end of the stick. I think this was designed to run on sugar, but in a very careful way.
Living in London, I can definitely say that I witness a lot of noise pollution, non-stop sirens, constant news about crime, murder, war, overcrowded fast food restaurants, a lot of drug abuse, depression and excess material consumption. I'm sure that many people around the world today experience the same things, but to different degrees. Do you believe this is a direct symptom of the fall, and that it will never stop getting worse unless we correct our diet and lifestyle?
to me, it's common sense. If these ancestral traditions of some kind of serious disconnection and slide into delusion have something to do with the problem with our brain, as I think it has, then it's obvious, if we've got a problem with our brain, everything else is going to be a mess. It's that simple. And particularly if it's a progressive condition, it's getting worse, then the symptoms are going to get worse. Well, our history, particularly our more recent history, our recorded history as it's often called, seems to be a process of increasingly insane decisions and cultures that can only be termed, well, pathocracy. It's basically increasingly run by the most degenerate aspects of our society, most degenerate percentage of population. So it's to me it's impossible that we ever solve the symptoms if we don't treat the cause. It's like taking somebody with classic mental health problems. Let's say, I don't know, it's a crude analogy. So you find somebody who's causing themselves self-harm, they haven't been able to feed themselves, the place is a complete disaster, they've almost burnt their house down. So you rescue them and you take them and you put them in a new house, but you don't treat the mental health condition. What's going to happen? Exactly the same thing. Well, that's what we're doing. We're out on the streets protesting at all the symptoms, as people have been doing for thousands of years. And actually the symptoms are getting worse, and the catastrophes are getting worse, and the society in general is heading in that direction of ever more dysfunction. We're becoming incredibly adept at building machines that are designed to kill each other. The layers of symptoms are increasing all the time, and yet all we do is chase the symptoms when the cause is not being treated at all. So of course it's going to get worse. It's a challenging thing to say, but it's also quite exciting, because actually if we focused on the cause, the one thing that's guaranteed to change our behaviour is to change the configuration of our neural system. You can change it in many ways. You could make it worse, for example, but if you change the configuration, how it's built, how it's fueled, what it runs on, guaranteed you will change behaviour radically. And yet we almost do everything we can to not do that. All we're doing is obsessing about the symptoms. We even have laws to stop us changing our consciousness system in ways that we know are beneficial. That's how insane we are.
How do you feel when schools, hospitals, the police force, the government, we could bracket these as the pillars of our society, all consume a lot of animal products and processed food? If they have degenerated neurosystems running on the left hemisphere, doesn't this undermine our whole world, day-to-day reality in society and what we experience as we label as life?
Well, again, I think the simple answer would be yes, but it's an inevitable consequence. It's again going back to this idea that if we've got serious mental health problems, that's exactly what we do. And typically, when you have serious mental health problems, your choices often make your mental health worse. So if we've got mental health problems, our choices as to how we construct society and our food choices aren't going to be anything other than mental health problem, or they're going to be choices made from a point of mental health disorder. So it's not a surprise. It's incredibly frustrating, particularly schools, I think, where you're taking the next generation and indoctrinating them in the same traditions that have never ever resulted in health and never ever resulted in a society that's functional, in my opinion. Yet we do the same thing, and defend it. Parents demanding that they have the place in school for their kids and that they get their 3 meals a day, as if that's somehow going to produce a different result than it did the last generation. So yes, it's very disturbing, and certainly some of our choices are inevitably going to make things worse. Again, the idea that we can construct the most complex perceptual equipment we know from things that we laughingly call junk, it's kind of a joke, but it's really, really scary and really sad, and leads to a lot of suffering, actually, either degenerative diseases or conflict, either interpersonal or on a global scale. And there's evidence, it's not like this is just some kind of hippie philosophy. Studies have been done, not to the extremes that maybe I'd be interested in them being investigated, but certainly within the parameters of so-called normal Western diet, we already know what's a lot better and what's a lot worse, and yet hospitals, schools, prisons, the places where we should have the very best, it's often the very worst. Now, if that's not serious mental ill health, I don't know what is.
I think it's sad that our so-called health experts, if I could label it as brainwashing, just misinform, whatever words we can attach to this, to our parents, to the schools, to whoever's in control, the leaders. They all believe this misinformation, and it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy that we'll just never break out of, because everyone agrees what we're doing is fine and there's nothing wrong. And as you mentioned, if we don't get to the root cause, nothing will ever be fixed. Well, if we're stuck in this mindset, how are we going to break out?
Well, it again, to me, it's an obvious and quite shocking. Once, if you're willing to ask these questions and embrace possible answers, I'm not saying I have the answers, but if you're willing to consider that it's mass delusion, and you know, I'm hardly the first person to look at these things. Many people consider our culture and society generally is suffering from mass delusion. I think it's even worse than that. It's incredibly serious mental health problems. And going back to your original point, it's just common sense. There's no way you're ever going to deal with the symptoms unless you treat the cause. Yes, sometimes it's worth managing the symptoms. So, for example, going back to people protesting about this, that and the other, you put enough pressure in one point, you can change a bit of the symptomology. Great. But while you're pushing it back in there, there's 30 more, ballooning out somewhere else. And that's the pattern I see. It's just getting worse and worse. And there's no way it can ever change if the cause is in here, which is what our ancestors told us it was.
What are some of the other things we can do other than diet that these techniques describe?
Well, I think diet is the foundation. Again, back to what we were covering before. The basic construction, design, and fuel. That's got to be the foundation. And our ancestors knew about this. It's hinted at in lots of traditions. But I think they were already in trouble, and they knew they were in trouble. We're going back thousands of years now. This isn't something that happened in the Industrial Revolution or something. We've been in trouble for a long time. And by definition, if we've been descending into serious mental health problems, then going further back, our ancestors were less afflicted. And I'm not talking about a couple of hundred years. I'm talking a much longer time scale. In which case they were almost certainly more insightful, and they did come up with some pretty cool treatments. And as far as I can tell, they seem to fall into three basic categories. We've already covered diet. Well, I'm going to call that kind of molecular engineering, because this thing is a phenomenal piece of kit. We shouldn't think of diet. We should think advanced molecular engineering. When we eat something, that's what we're really doing. We're becoming molecular engineers and deciding how to design the most advanced piece of kit we know. But anyway, we've touched on that. The other major approaches, as far as I can tell, were really about trying to dampen or inhibit or switch off the most afflicted side of our brain. I don't want to demonize this side of our brain. It's like all of us, we're victims of this circumstance, and it's just damaged. Nevertheless, it's causing us serious problems. It's like if we badly damaged our eye and we couldn't see properly or at all, we'd be stupid to keep using it. If we had a good eye, we'd switch eyes and then maybe try and repair it. We wouldn't doggedly go, well, I'm going to stick with this eye. I can't see anything, go straight over the cliff, which is kind of what we're doing. So a whole bunch of approaches to try and dampen the influence. I mean, the obvious connection would be, and we've already talked about this, so our left hemisphere is speech dominant. In fact, it almost defines itself with words. It doesn't like to shut up because it almost sinks into nothingness. So it's always babbling on about something, and if you get it to shut up, it kind of panics because it's like, I'm not here anymore. I'll make some noise. And by that I mean the voice in your head as well as your audible voice. And so there are traditions that would fall generally under the Trappist tradition, where people go into a kind of retreat mode and they don't speak. Not for 5 minutes.
Vipassana, they call it, I think.
That's another, that's a sort of Asiatic tradition as far as I know. but there are parallel traditions, not just the one. But yeah, it's interesting. It's cropped up in different places. Part of a lot of meditative approaches, calm, the chattering voice, this kind of stuff. And if you can get it to calm right down by not speaking, and not for an hour or two, talking several hours to several weeks, and if people get into this, could be much longer. It almost shuts it off, or it goes on to standby. And the reason that's a good idea is then because it allows this other self to begin emerging. Of course, a lot of these traditions have become fragmented and almost reductionist, so you'll get people practicing a particular piece of this, what I think was a holistic approach, and it's effective to a point, but they're missing the biochemistry, or they're missing the approach. So the other approach would be things to stimulate the hemisphere that still has some of this capacity. And again, they worked out approaches to do exactly that. But I think they were working holistically. They put all this together, so you have a really good biochemical rebuild, and then you combine approaches to inhibit the damage, or the more damaged hemisphere, with treatments really to engage the hemisphere that can still work a bit. And that combination, it's a very simple formula, is enough, if you put all the components right, to give you experiences, even if they're brief, a few minutes. They're so transcendent and so ridiculously different to day-to-day life that they can be enough to inform the rest of your life, even one experience, let alone maybe putting together a regime where you try and access that once a month or something. So I think that's what our ancestors were telling us, and that's a very simple formula. Good rebuild, get all the chemistry in there, potentiates everything. The right hemisphere needs that high spec chemistry, because remember, it's still got some high spec architecture in there. The left hemisphere is so broken now, it can run on anything. It doesn't make that much difference to the left. It can be junk food, or it could be high quality fruit or whatever. I'm not saying it wouldn't make any difference, but it's just not got much capacity. Whereas the right hemisphere still has a lot of capacity. So if you access it without the high spec chemistry, it's going to be interesting, and it might be quite profound, but it's still kind of not really fired up. It needs this high octane, complex biochemistry to really fly. Well, again, our ancestors knew that. That's why they talk about natural diet and preparation and fasting. And then you inhibit your left hemisphere, and then on top of that, you stimulate your right hemisphere. And when you get that combination working, you only need a minute or two to be staggered for the rest of your life to explain what the hell just happened. And it's not something that you wouldn't want to do again. It's quite the opposite. If you could press the button and say, I'll just stay here, you wouldn't take your finger off the button. It's beyond description.
Have you personally experienced this, or met anybody who's been practicing these techniques?
I think these techniques exist in all these traditions, and some of them have been picked up, usually in their quite diluted form, in Western culture. So they're around, and they've been around for a long time, and a lot of people are practicing by degrees. However, in the ancestral traditions strongly hinted this, and the evidence seems to be building that, aside from everything else we've got to deal with, that it looks like there was some major catastrophic events 10 to 12,000 years ago that pretty much wiped the slate clean. So we're almost like trying to pick up the pieces post-apocalyptic catastrophe. And it makes sense to me now that, we've got little bits of the jigsaw, and we tend to think we've got a really big bit because it works a little bit. But I think these were always designed to work together. So yes, I've met a lot of people practicing this, that or the other, but I've not met that many people, some, and it's starting to happen, putting more and more of these things together, and their subjective experience, again, it's, so for example, I've met quite a lot of people who are interested in psychedelics, and it's a very powerful way to shift your consciousness, and I think a lot of people who are interested in that tend to think, well, there's nothing more powerful than this is the best thing to do. But I've then met people who've been on that path, and they've got interested, or we've had discussions, and they've started putting really good biochemistry in place, and maybe combining a little bit of sleep deprivation before. So they've got one reference point that was blowing them away, and then the feedback I get is, oh my God, I thought psychedelics were powerful. It's like tinkering with just the skin. When you really dig in with these combined approaches, it starts to fly. And to fully answer your question, I have done a lot of experimentation, mostly combining sleep deprivation, rich diet, and techniques to stimulate my right hemisphere. And it's still a bit slippery, but I've had glimpses. I've been incredibly lucky, I think, especially quite early on, where I've had glimpses that even 25 years later, I still wouldn't know how to tell you what the experience was like. All I can say is, can I have it again, please, permanently? You know, it off the scale kind of stuff. You know, cliche, classic mystical experiences. And what I'm excited about, and again, just trawling the literature and looking at what our ancestors were trying to tell us, because I haven't invented any of this stuff, of course. When you step back far enough, it looks like quite a simple formula. It's not that difficult. Certainly in the face of what we're doing in the symptoms we face, yes, you've got to put some effort in. And yes, it's probably going to take a little bit of time. But in the whole history of our degeneration and looking at what we're doing, relatively speaking, this isn't difficult. It's not spending your whole life staring at the back of a cave, maybe getting a tiny glimmer of something or whatever. It's quite formulaic, and it's very, very powerful, and it's relatively rapid. In fact, my only caution is actually take it slowly if you're going to get interested in these things, because you might surprise yourself how quickly you can have the kind of experiences at one time were shrouded in mystery, and almost you weren't even allowed to approach them or discuss them. And I think putting it in modern language, well, it's just, and of course our modern language is arbitrary, I know that, but you know, talking about neurology and hemispheric shift and diet and molecular biology, you put that formula together, and I'd say 9 times out of 10 guaranteed a big shift or your money back.
When I go around in society, I see a lot of people who are somewhat stressed, depressed, anxious, nervous. It seems like this is the polar opposite and far beyond what anybody gets to experience in our world today. What words would you use to describe this? Is there any words we can use to describe this state of being?
I don't think there's any words can properly encompass anything, really. They're just you know, abstractions and labels, but of course that's what we're stuck with. So I'm going to borrow terms that crop up in other traditions, and my brief glimpses, and I think that's all they were, and from what I've read and spoken to other people, the terms that come out of these traditions compared to our normal state, things like divine rapture, I mean, that might be quite a good way to encompass it. A perpetual state of joy and wonder, being profoundly overwhelmed by your very being. It's not like, you know, today we're obsessed with filling our time with bits of crap that we don't need and fiddling about with our phones. Well, when this thing works, it's like, you know, 10 billion times the best VR system you could even imagine today with our stupid computers and technology. This thing, just when it lights up, you feel, and maybe even are, connected with the cosmos. So you can stand outside and stare at the sky for a week, and you haven't even begun to get bored. You're just in a state of rapture, because it's like, oh my God, now I know who I am. And when I say now I know who I am, it's not the normal I, it's a kind of interconnected I. And that's echoed down the ages. There's nothing new in this, of course. In fact, if anything, we've become more and more disconnected from these experiences.
And you mentioned that in the present moment, if you combine these techniques, you can have a brief, and you said it could be a few minutes of this state of being. Do you, if we could say theorize, do you believe that our ancestors were experiencing this for a few minutes as well, or were they constantly in this experience?
I think if you go back far enough, that was the default, that was the norm. And I think it's hinted at in our ancestral oral traditions, these very archaic traditions that are difficult to date. You know, we've got our written records and we've got our temples and monuments that go back, and new discoveries all the time. But I think some of these very ancient traditions really are very ancient. And they seem, I mean, obviously you've got to be aware of seeing what you want to see, but they seem to talk in a unified way of our ancestors quite literally being in a very, very different state of being very difficult to describe, hence the terms like divine, you know, they kind of point at what it was like, but they couldn't really go much further. And I think the pieces seem to add up to me that in the forest, after this prolonged period of symbiosis when our brand new brain was almost exploding out of the top of our head, and it was flooded with these chemicals, it was probably perfectly symmetrical in its function and could light up in a very different way to the way our neural system works now, then yes, I think that was the normal state. And you can then start, and this is obviously starting getting out there a little bit more, but what this thing really is, I think, is I can't say it's the only one, but it's one of the cosmos's self-experience systems. You know, it's like a self-aware system, and it opens its eye. I'm talking about on neocortex, and it can perceive itself, and it's in love with itself, and that's pretty much all there is. Except it's this infinite cosmos, so it's like not going to get bored with itself in a hurry. So yes, I think that was a sustainable state while the symbiosis was in place. But when that separation occurred, I think we're on this slow, slippery slope to less and less in that state, having to use treatments. Well, why do we need treatments? Because something's wrong. You know, we tend to we tend to look at the traditional practices with reverence and almost, you know, certainly that's how I grew up initially. It was like, ooh, you know, what's metal? Well, you just don't question these things, you just get on with them. But I see them now as treatments, and then you have to ask, well, what were they treating, and why do you need to treat anything, and why doesn't it just work? Because nature's pretty good at producing things that work. Well, why do we have to go to the monastery or take plant medicines or sit in a cave or do whatever the hell and get a little glimpse? To me, it's really simple. It's because it's badly broken. That's why. And we're having to poke and prod it to get a bit of life out of it. Well, if we're going to do that, we might as well try and understand exactly what the best thing is to do and try and get it to work a little bit better. But yes, I think as we've slid into these more degenerate states, it's got harder and harder, or we've had to use particular approaches. And again, I think we've become confused about those things. Because I'm saying today, actually, I think we can access those states, and it's not as difficult as you think. I'm also saying be cautious, of course. It's not something that just, like going out and having a few pints on a Friday night and getting into a fight. It's not. You still need to do your preparation, do your research, because when you're messing around with your perceptual equipment, I think there's masses of latent potential in there. But if you get it wrong, you can mash yourself up forever. So be careful. But I think there's something pretty amazing that isn't as hard to get at as we've been led to believe.
People would argue that looking around, we observe smartphones, fast cars, skyscrapers, Boeing jets, and other modern technological advancements. However, the primates in the forest today are living in their biological eco-niche that we describe as our origins, consistently eating a raw food diet. They sit in silence, but some people would argue that they just sit around and climb trees all day and just forage for fruit. Why haven't they advanced or developed the way we have intellectually if they're eating a fruit-based diet?
Yeah, it's a question that does crop up, and it's a fair question. I think there's a few parts to this, but so I'd start with the first one. Our definition of advanced and what we've achieved, I would immediately suggest we deeply question that, because I don't think there's anything we've produced in Western culture that is remotely advanced in context. I think I said that we were talking earlier, and it's like, to me, everything we buy is tainted with blood. If you follow the supply chains, if you look at everything we've designed and built, there's a massive chain of suffering there, human suffering and ecological damage. That can't in any way be advanced to me. And most of what we produce, we design it to throw it away as soon as we possibly can. And then on top of that, much of our so-called advancement is coming out of defence contracts. We pump a huge amount of resource into creating ever more advanced ways to kill each other. Well, there's a massive conflict there, you know, advanced killing each other. I don't really think I should have to say too much more, but I don't see it as advanced, and I know a lot of other people don't, but we have been programmed and we have been sold the idea that being able to get in a tube of metal and fly to another country is somehow amazing, even though the cost of building the thing and the fuel and the this and that and the other is causing us all sorts of trouble. So that's an area that I think we have to look at with very different lens, really. I don't think we're advanced at all. I mean, I might have said this earlier, I'm not anti-technology, even anti-industry. If there are things that can improve our existence, help restore us to a better state, or even help us to evolve, I'm not even averse to that. If it's designed from the ground up and done in the most humane, intelligent, eco-friendly way, we could probably build stuff and do stuff. Whether we'd want to, I'm not so sure. I mean, you know, maybe there is scope to do something like that and do it in a sensible way. But so another part of the question is, or you talked about, well, they just sit around. I'll deal with the primates in the forest in a minute, but I've already touched on this, that the human system, the human neural system, clearly has the wiring somewhere buried in it to elicit states that make all this seem like the junk it is, because people have those experiences. People have been quite lost in the world of materialism and wanting more stuff, as if somehow they're going to feel better and make everything better. And then they've had experiences, it's not that common, but it definitely happens, that are so powerful that all that becomes the garbage it is, and the only interest is that experience and how to maintain it or get back to it. Because the experiences that our neural system can facilitate and we can be drawn into make everything we've ever manufactured and everything we've ever dreamt of manufacturing seem like the stupid little kids' toys they are. And I don't mean to be detrimental to kids, actually. I retract that. You know, the idiocy it is. So again, there's questions there. I can't give definitive answers, but I think we should be looking long and hard at that. So one more point, going back, because I've had this question quite a few times. As far as I can tell, looking at all the data and the evidence and the pollen records and the climate records and so on, this idea of the symbiosis failing, so species that get locked in or kidnapped by the plants and they're part of this particularly tight symbiotic relationship, this eating reproductive organs and not changing the physiology because it's changing everything. I think there are two things there: how long you've been in that relationship, and it's quite an unusual relationship, and it's potentially very unstable because the forest can go. And then how long is it since you crashed out? Those are two very important factors, and there's a lot of variables there. And I certainly, my focus is humans, and I think this process of crashing out, where the forest's either fragmented and some of the fragments have disappeared, and occasionally it's virtually all gone. I think there's been successive crash outs, successive waves, and it's not just affected humans, it's affected all the species locked into those kind of relationships. So I think currently where we're at, it would have been different going back hundreds of thousands, millions of years, but I think now there isn't any species left in that relationship intact. So the great apes that you're talking about in the forest, I'm pretty convinced they're also post-symbiotic refugees. The fact that they're still living in the forest doesn't change that. It's not living in the forest, it's having an unbroken relationship with the reproductive organs for a long time. And if it breaks for any length of time, the degeneration is sufficient that even if you then start eating that way again, it doesn't bring this symbiosis back online.
So the diet is, if we call it, the building blocks, what we fuel, design, and build our brain on, is more important than the environment we're actually in. So, for example, for real people today, you're technically saying it doesn't matter where you are on this rock, as long as you maintain that symbiosis, you can.
In principle, I'd say that is more important. I'm not in any way ignoring where you are, because that's a big factor as well. But I think the basic biochemical mechanisms are the most powerful. And to go back to this question, because there's a bit more to it than that, and it might be too complicated to explain in this interview, but I've got stuff online. It's not just the real-time effect of fruit. There is a real-time effect. So okay, you've got your basic mammal trundling through the woods. The plants kidnap it, it's snatch and grab in the van. Right, you're going to eat fruit. You're going to do this job for us, kind of thing. And so, eating fruit, there's a real-time effect, and
it's a tasty job.
Has some of these impacts I'm talking about. The real magic starts to happen, I think, when during that process of, I'm going to call it juvenilization, it's not just the fruit that juvenilizes a system. The fruit then juvenilizes your own hormone system, the neuroendocrine system. So the brain that runs the hormone system, that becomes juvenilized, and that's a very powerful system. So the fruit starts the process and stays there and provides lots of other things, but it also turns our own neuroendocrine system into a more juvenilized system, and that's where you get the feedback. So the fruit's having an effect, and then our own system lines up and starts basically creating a more juvenilized mammalian system, and the two work together, and that's where you get this runaway feedback loop. That's why it runs away so quickly. Now you take the fruit out of the equation, and you might think, oh well, as long as you put it back sometime soon, but the problem is you've created a very powerful mammalian neuroendocrine system. Now it's running in the same direction as the fruit, and that's great. That's where you get the massive expansion. Take the fruit out and it stalls and starts going into reverse. You put the fruit back and it's not as powerful. So that our own endocrine system drags us back down. It's gone into reverse and you can't stop it. It's like you've built a big heavy car with a big flywheel in it, and the fruit's fueling that, and it's great because you've got it going where you want it. But if it goes off in a direction you don't want, it's bloody hard to stop it, and the fruit can't stop it. So that's where the problem lies with trying to re-establish this. It's not just enough to eat fruit, and it's not just the primates that live in the forest that still eat fruit. They've all gone through this window and it's collapsed, and it doesn't restart again because the fruit creates this very powerful mechanism that becomes more dominant than the fruit, at least for juvenilization. And if it starts going into reverse, it's what we see now. It's like our neuroendocrine system's becoming less juvenile almost as we watch. We watch the age of puberty drop by 10-15% in 100-150 years. Well, that's the window where the brain expands and develops. So we're dealing now with the fruit changed our endocrine system, and the two were in alignment, and they both ran off and created this massive brain. One fails, the other fails. Put this one back, and the other one's so powerful it keeps failing. And that's the problem. Now, I'm not saying this can't be changed, but we've got to do this consciously. We can't just do it with putting the fruit back, because the fruit built such a powerful neuroendocrine system that when it went off the rails, it can't pull it back on, at least not without making some very conscious choices. So that's where I think a lot of people misunderstand what I'm saying. It's all about the fruit. And yeah, it is kind of all about the fruit, but it's not enough to put fruit back. In fact, we're in such a corrupted state. We're not specialized fruit eaters anymore. We're not in that symbiotic relationship. And fruit's a highly specialized food. It's like packets of rocket fuel. And you kind of need a specialist system to eat it all the time. Incidentally, once in a while is not a problem. Well, we're not in that space anymore. So that's why I always say, well, yes, we need to get back to that, but we've got to do it at the speed our individual bodies can manage. And it's a kind of bootstrapping effect, where you put some of this stuff back, and that potentiates a right hemisphere. So you can use some of the treatments I was talking about to move a bit. That means you're tapping into a better assimilation system, so you can eat a bit more of this stuff. And you've almost got to incrementally tiptoe your way back out of the mess, in my opinion. It can be done, I think. But the idea that fruit on its own can fix this, it's a fantastic idea, but our ancestors were way smarter than us, and if it was simply that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And that's what applies to the great apes and so on, where, well, why haven't they done? First of all, like I say, what we consider advanced is garbage, in my opinion. But even if it wasn't, they've also gone through this catastrophic drying, the collapse of the forest, and a lot of the arboreal primates disappeared. Well, you can imagine if you depended on trees and the trees have gone, you're in real trouble. A few survive along the gallery forests, along the rivers. Well, the bipeds living in the forest, which is now becoming more accepted, 20, 30 years ago, bipeds, forest, no, savanna. Well, actually, there were bipedal apes in the forest, our ancestors. Well, if the forest goes, it's a massive disaster, but you've got more options. You can wander off over the hill and try and survive, and a lot of them didn't. Even though we're supposed to survive, we were supposed to be honed on the savannah and acquired all these traits in this very hostile environment. It's remarkable how few of the hominids survived in those environments because they're so harsh. It's only the ones that had the really big brains with the superb intelligence. We weren't really adapted, we just used our intelligence, and in doing so, sowed the seeds of our own dysfunction, because the better we got at surviving, the less connected we were to what actually built our brain in the first place. So, eating tubers and cooking things that are toxic, great, because you've got to stay alive. But they're those things are unable to maintain this neurofeedback loop. Only the fruit could do that. And once the break's gone, I don't know how long, 4 generations, 10 generations, 100 once that gap's appeared, then you're really trying to stop your own neuroendocrine system spiraling out of control. And that's a very powerful piece of kit. It can be done, I think, but I just want to be clear on that. Fruit is going to be part of the solution if there is a solution. But on its own, it's now just one of several factors. It initiated, it's weird, it was powerful enough to initiate the whole thing, but then it built this more powerful thing than itself, if you like, and that's the problem we're dealing with. A degenerating or a more primitive or a more mature typical mammalian neuroendocrine system, and all that's trying to do is build a typical mammalian system and a typical mammalian brain. And typical mammalian brains, first of all, they're not usually very big because it's very expensive to build and run. And without being discriminatory compared to, say, the best of our capacity, most mammals aren't that bright. They're just locked into survival, which is great. That's what they do. They tend to be hierarchical, tend to be quite aggressive, and so on. Well, that's what our system's reverting back to, because that's what it did way before the forest. So it's just trying to go back to what it did. And I think we're at the very final stages of being able to stop that if we want to. I mean, we can choose to continue down this path. And I think we're so insane that we might actually do that. But we do have a choice. We can either become more primitive, lose connection with even how messed up we are, which has kind of happened, or we can go, hang on, how can we bootstrap this back? And I think with our collective knowledge and intelligence we still have, I think we could do that. But that's what it's going to need. We're going to need to recognise the depth of our insanity.
I think this is a really interesting point that you've made here, because I know you've alluded to earlier there was a very difficult word to pronounce that you said that describes a state where the situation is so bad you don't even know it.
Yeah, it's more of an unfamiliar word. It is bandied around a bit, and I try and use these words to show that they actually exist and people have done studies on them, and go and look at the studies, and it's weird when you dig into them. But yeah, so the classic example, and I think it's relevant to us right throughout our lives, but and it's quite tragic as well, both individually and collectively. But as people start developing symptoms of dementia, and very early symptoms can be there very, even in certainly 30s, late 30s, not full clinical symptoms, but the signs can be there. But anyway, as you move into what's called dementia, when it's mild, people are aware, or they can be aware, and they can be in and out of it a bit, and they can try and compensate and do things. But as the condition progresses, it eventually reaches a tipping point where you just don't know you have dementia anymore, and you may never come out of it again, and that's it. Well, a term that describes that is anosognosia. I guess it's Latin or something for. It basically translates in you lose the capacity to know, you're incapacitated. It's that simple. And it's so bizarre when you start trawling the neurological and psychological literature that this term's used a lot in connection with humans and our psychology generally. and most specifically with the left hemisphere. And again, this is the hemisphere that plays a massive role in our day-to-day lives. I mean, the data's there. I'm not saying this. I've just trawled around and found the data that already exists. And I've been bandying a paper around recently. I think I might have sent you a link to it. And I don't know if I came across this about 10 years ago when I was putting the book together. I came a lot of similar papers. But, there's a paper, just day-to-day sort of paper that's basically outlining how much of the most recent and advanced part of our brain we lose as we age. 20% of our left hemisphere erodes as we get older. Now think about that in engineering terms, or I don't know, you've just spent $5,000 on the most powerful Mac computer, or you've spent $50,000 on a supercomputer or something, and it does everything you want it to do, whatever the hell that is. And then somebody comes along and says, I'm just going to cut 20% of that off. It'll be fine. It won't make any difference. You'd look at, well, you wouldn't let them anywhere near it. You'd be like, get the hell out of here, you idiot. And yet we have papers that document that that's happening and happened to our perceptual equipment. Is it on the 9 o'clock news? Are we teaching this to our kids? No, it's some obscure paper in a file somewhere. But it's there, and that's what we've lost. So yeah, anosognosia, I think we're all suffering from it. It's not just the split brain patients with their own exposed left. Yes, that really highlights it. So please, anybody watching this, do your research. Look at anosognosia in relation to the left hemisphere. Then you'll hear people say, oh, well, it's just because it's just the left hemisphere. No, exactly the same traits exist in us all. They're just slightly masked by the right hemisphere's influence. We are deluded. We haven't a clue as to how ill we are. We can't recognise the absurdity of our decisions. This all fits under the umbrella of anosognosia to me in terms of our mental health. So please check it out. I'm not making this stuff up, and there are loads of papers written on it. And the scary thing is there are loads of papers written on it.
Don Bennett, disease avoidance specialist and raw food health educator from health101.org, has asked a question, and he says, Tony, is it safe to say that the act of putting fire to our food and the adoption of eating animals has led to a world with such rampant greed, avarice, racism and selfishness?
I think it's massively contributed, massively. I'd go a step further back than that, and that my perspective is that it was the symbiotic disconnection from fruit that started the process and caused massive problems. Remember, again, we talked about symbiosis, so think of it as a hybrid being. You've got the trees and the mammal, and they're locked together, and they're sharing the same biochemistry. The plants are providing the bulk of our neurochemistry, all those chemicals that get into our brain and have an impact. Mammals just produce a small range of neurochemicals. The fruit's supplying a lot of extra neuroactive chemicals and protective chemicals and all this kind of stuff. And most importantly, the thing I've been focusing on most, this hormonal effect that kept us in this juvenile state that allowed us to grow this, not just big brain, size is relevant, it's this different kind of brain, this juvenile, undifferentiated brain that allowed these phenomenally different traits and abilities. So that separation to me is the disconnection, is the start of the fall from grace. Absolutely, since then we've almost gone out of our way to make things 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times worse, or speed up the process. So heating food, yeah, of course there's very good arguments to be made in terms of survival, that using fire to transform things that aren't edible into something that will sustain you at least, and survival is survival, it's not thrive, is it? I've no doubt that was essential at times, but then they become cultural habits, and then they progress, and then that's all we ever do. And at a molecular level, because I like to think about this at molecular engineering level. So heating the molecular matrix of what you're building yourself with is totally alien to biology. It's never happened in billions of years, if the timelines are correct. It's never been part of biological evolution at all. And in fact, the reason that you can detoxify foods, make some poisonous things safe to, well, when I say safe to eat, they're not going to kill you, at least not straight away, is because it changes the molecular structure. That's how it works. Well, if it's changing the molecular structure of the poisons and denaturing that molecular structure so it doesn't hurt you anymore, what's it doing to all the other molecular structures? You know, and so you're radically changing the design and build specifications again, and I've touched on this, of the most complex thing we know. Well, I can't imagine for a second that after billions of years you suddenly take a massive right angle turn and do something that's never been done in biology, it's alien stuff, that's somehow not going to have a massive impact. Is it beneficial? Doesn't look like it. So I think the heating and cooking, yes, probably born out of essential survival, but it's become part of a conditioned way. And yeah, it's just denatured the construction materials and also allowed us to eat things that we should never have eaten, and they've now become habits. So we're now building ourselves from denatured molecular material and some stuff that we shouldn't be eating at all, or a lot of stuff. And then when it comes to animals, I mean, I know this is a loaded question, and I didn't get into any of this for ethics, and I don't even think we need to go there, simply because I think our problem with ethics comes from our insanity. And if you look at it very simplistically, I'm talking a lot about hormones and basically trying to calm our mammalian hormones down with the plant compounds so that we can grow this new brain that brought with it that kind of juvenile or almost childlike compassion and empathy, where, you know, you even see it with some of the forest primates to a limited degree, not chimpanzees so much, but let's say some of the others, where they're curious and they'll pick up insects and animals and they won't eat them, they'll look at them and let them go. I mean, it's certainly been filmed, I don't know how common it is, but I think that was our relationship with other species for the most part. And then paradoxically, when we've ended up in these dreadful situations and had to survive and maybe had to kill things and eat them, and that's become part of our heritable culture. So I see it more that, you know, we're fueling our own degeneration, we're accelerating our return to a more primitive form. And I think that's what eating animals does, at least at a functional level. I know there's a lot more to discuss about that, but I'm just going to stick with that. It's basically making us more stupid and more primitive and more aggressive. Well, if that's what we want to do, great, you know.
Don Bennett has also shared a statement. I've seen enough people adopt a fruit-based diet, so I've seen the pitfalls and have developed ways of doing it that increase the odds of success so the person can thrive. This revolves around the fact that a fruit-based diet is not fortified with any nutrients, and a typical Western diet is. And worse, a fruit-based diet even often consists of nutritionally subpar fruit, which makes it more difficult to thrive. But luckily, there are ways to compensate for the low-quality agri-based industry fruit and grains. When this is done, and people adopting this diet are educated properly so that they are vigilant to get enough D, B12, and iodine, also, this is when people can thrive. Do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, clearly, eating a supermarket unripe, soil-deficient mainstream produce isn't exactly going to replicate the ancestral diet. So, do you have any thoughts on compensating for all these factors of the environment we're in and the what we see when we go to buy produce?
Well, so I think Don's absolutely on the right track in terms of trying to make sure what you're eating is nutritionally, the whole spectrum's covered. And there's no doubt what we can eat now is very different to what we might have been able to eat 50, 100,000 years ago. So I agree with that completely. And some of the things you mentioned, I mean, you know, we almost certainly evolved on the equator and naked. Well, if we're living at high latitudes like where we are now, it's pretty obvious we're going to be deficient in whatever the sun can give us. I mean, we all focus on vitamin D, but there's more and more evidence that just being outside and getting some sunlight fuels all sorts of reactions and changes. In fact, I saw something the other day about sunlight, UVB light changing your gut flora and so on. So there's a lot of things have changed, and I think we should be looking to make sure that we can fill those gaps as best as possible. Same with iodine, B12 and all this kind of stuff. I'd broaden that slightly and say, yes, the food's changed and we've got to be cautious, absolutely. However, I think we've changed even more, and I go back to the idea of symbiosis. If a relationship with the reproductive organs, with fruit, had the massive impact I think it had, including growing as this new brain and bringing with it all those traits, but on our physiology and all the rest of it, you can't then really argue that since the disconnection from the forest there's not been an equally large change. So we're not fruit-eating symbiotic specialists anymore, in my opinion. At the very least, our neuroassimilation system, if our brain's changed as much as I think it has, our neuroassimilation system, a connection between our brain and our gut, that's all changed massively, and that's a big part of our assimilation. On top of that, and linked with that, and it's getting more and more attention these days, is our gut flora is vastly different to what it was. You know, there's comparisons between Western culture, gut flora, and say hunter-gatherer. Big gap. Well, there's an equally big gap between, say, tribes living in that kind of lifestyle and forest-dwelling apes. Because some of the gut flora, you know, it's quite responsive. You change your diet, the gut flora will get into you somehow. It's quite motile, quite mobile. But some gut flora is much more heritable, but still, you know, will only thrive in certain foods. So let's say you're eating your fruit diet and half your gut flora would get there anyway, in the soil, on the leaves, whatever. But some of it's much more difficult to get. You know, it's random. It'll happen over time. But it's heritable when you're born, or through other, you know, personal interaction. The gut flora spreads. Well, if you lose that, so you lose the fruit diet, you lose all your gut flora. You start eating fruit again, some of it's going to come back, but the heritable stuff isn't going to come back, at least not easily. I mean, people are now talking about fecal implants to try and get better gut flora. They're only looking as far as hunter-gatherer tribes, probably because they've got better gut flora than us. But I think our forest-dwelling relatives have a much better gut flora for eating fruit, and we don't have that. So I think that and our neuroassimilation system, by comparison to our distant ancestors, are at a fraction of their ability to deal with this diet. And going back to the whole question, a specialised fruit diet is quite a unique thing. You know, it's not a particularly common thing. I mean, a lot of animals will eat fruit incidentally and when it's in season, but to eat it as a specialist thing all the time, it's quite a rare thing. And I always liken it to saying, well, it's in many ways it's like the rocket fuel of diets. And that sounds exciting, and it is exciting, but you need a well-built rocket to handle it, or it's going to blow up or damage itself. And I think we're in pretty poor shape now. So I think Don's right, absolutely maximising the nutrition and filling in any gaps because of culture and cultivation problems, variety problems, and so on and so forth. But also compensating for our deficiencies, and by that our physiological deficiencies. Obviously trying to improve your gut flora, trying to access a better state of mind when you're eating, and generally it's going to help your assimilation and this kind of stuff. And as I've said a couple of times, that's why I'm a bit more cautious about moving towards, or suggesting people move towards a fruit-based diet without doing all this preparation and research. And I'd suggest moving very slowly for most people. I'm not saying some people can't, you know, some people do this and get away with it. But I think if you're going to move in that direction, do it very, very slowly, because I think there's a lot more moving parts than just the food. That is important, and I think Don's right. And, you know, he's one of the few people I think who takes, in my opinion, a very considered and responsible approach to the whole nutritional spectrum, and looking to fill in any gaps in what some people think, oh, well, it's fruit, it's nature, it's all perfect. Yeah, one time it probably was, but there's a lot of reasons why it's not. So yeah, I think take all these and whatever other factors you can dig up and move slowly forward with them.
Tony, is going vegan and not cooking our food enough? Does it matter what raw foods we eat? Would you include leafy greens, nuts and seeds into this approach, or should we just focus on our symbiosis with fruits, particularly tropical fruits?
That's a complicated question. I think in principle, a plant-based diet with a lot of fruit in it is much closer to our biological origins. I think the challenge with that, particularly with anything other than fruit, and even fruit to a degree, I think particularly in our culture and more widely, we're in poor shape, partly in the ways I've described, but even things like the integrity of our gut, leaky gut, this kind of stuff. We've eaten such trash that switching to a plant-based diet, particularly a raw plant-based diet, remember, other than fruit, and often it's species specific or symbiotic specific, but because some fruits actually we can't eat and some are poisonous, that's quite unusual, but it does happen. But the rest of the plant material doesn't want to be eaten. It's heavily defended with chemicals and defences to stop us eating it. Now, it's quite clear that our relatives and almost certainly our ancestors had a gut that could handle that, and that's absolutely great. But I'm not sure our gut generally is in such good shape, particularly if you're moving quickly from a diet that damages your gut to a diet that, well, it doesn't damage your gut, it'll test your gut. So it's like, it's like you're punch drunk and then you're getting in the ring with somebody who's twice your size. Well, you really want to get everything strong first. So I'd suggest starting off, moving in that direction, but starting off with the things that are going to irritate your gut the least and get the least reactions to, and slowly build your strength back up. And I think a plant-based diet can do that. But again, for a lot of people, move cautiously and start, with a lightly cooked plant-based diet, because for all that might sound counterintuitive, it's gonna detoxify a bit some of the chemicals that we probably could have dealt with ease in the past, but that some people will struggle with, and it'll cause allergies and this kind of stuff. I mean, nuts and seeds, particularly nuts. We've all heard the stories of people who had a tiny bit of this nut or that nut, they go into anaphylactic shock and they die or whatever. Well, it's like a mild version of that, so I think we need to, I don't know if it's ancient Greek philosophy or it's, the gut is the key to your health. Well, I think there's masses of truth in that, and the integrity of the gut wall, the gut flora. I think these things need to be strengthened before you plough straight into a fully raw diet, particularly with leaves, nuts, seeds, because they're defended. But there are things you can do. As I say, you can choose more. Like we've bred a lot of greens where we've bred that stuff out of them. So I said, well, lettuce might be a good idea, as an example, not just to eat, of course, where it's probably a lot less toxic than its counterparts or its ancestors were. Seeds, well, you can soak them overnight or ferment them, this kind of stuff. Fruit, for the most part, is less problematic, although it can be problematic for other reasons. Again, until you've got the fat out of your blood and you've got your gut flora in place, you've got to watch the sugar even from fruit to start with. I think some people have. So I'd say move in that direction, but it's, again, I don't want to give the impression it's, this is our ancestral diet, we can just get on and eat it. In some ways it was a highly specialised diet and we had a highly specialised system to go with it. Now we don't, so I think we've got to bridge that gap carefully, and don't just presume because it's raw and natural it's going to be easy. I mean, I kind of did that when I started out, and I think mostly I got away with it. There was some things I probably would have done differently now if I'd known what I know now, but I've certainly heard of people getting into trouble and even getting big reactions and allergies from things that it's leaves, it's roots grated up, but again, they don't want to be eaten, the fallback foods, the seeds, especially seeds and nuts, mostly they don't want to be eaten. So I'd urge caution. I'm not saying that isn't the direction to go in, but go very cautiously, build your system back up, and if things, listen to your body as well. If you read this book, or you've watched this video or whatever it is, wow, that sounds good, I'm going to try it. Well, okay, but go cautiously. And if you're getting negative reactions, slow it down. Doesn't mean you can't get there. Doesn't mean there's not something good around the corner. But don't just keep going and it's not working, because a lot of people get dogmatic and, I'm going to do this, and 3 years later they're in trouble because they've not watched the reactions,
I think one example is that even for me, people who go 100% raw overnight, you do get adverse powerful effects from just eating fruits, because they're very powerful foods to eat. They're very highly cleansing on the body. That one could almost say that they're having negative symptoms from eating a fruit-based diet, but really that is not the fruit that's the problem, as you've mentioned. It's actually the system that's been damaged.
Well, I think what you're talking about is that, because I went through that, where you make that big change in it seems like a lot of stuff starts coming out of your body smells, and it's, you know, and you get more spots and all this kind of stuff. I'd say that's different but related, and yes, even that I think should be managed carefully. When you're young and if you're reasonably vibrant anyway, you can tolerate those kind of powerful changes quite quickly. But for the most part, I'd still always urge caution, doing it slowly and just keeping a step behind a crisis. Don't push it too hard. I mean, some people have good reasons to push things quickly. They might have a particular condition or disease where they need to make rapid change. And some people just get away with it anyway. They've got a more robust system. But I don't, you know, like I say, the plant kingdom, chemically at least, is way more defended than most of the animal system. Again, it sounds a bit odd, but you're probably going to run into less problems in terms of allergies eating meat than you will with a lot of plants. Yet quite clearly our physiology is plant-based, whatever the mainstream think. So it's getting back to that robust state where we can eat all those things without batting an eyelid, and I think a lot of us aren't at that stage. So yeah, there's a lot to think about. But I think overall, I mean, I you know, it's difficult to test, but I certainly feel like heading down that path myself over the years, I feel sharper. I feel like I can think about things more quickly than I could when I was 20, 25, and even now, you know. There's a lot of benefits to be had, but it's a little bit of a convoluted journey for some people, and it's not always, this is natural, don't cook the food, eat plant stuff. Sounds great, sounds like it should work every time, but in reality it doesn't work, it doesn't work every time because our system's changed, and like I say, plants have evolved for a long time not to be eaten, except fruit, of course. And I mean, I don't eat exclusively fruit because it's too expensive. It's not available. This kind of stuff. So I eat a lot. You know, I eat fruit, but I eat a lot of plant-based stuff as well, and I feel quite comfortable with that now.
Whole plant-based.
Well, you know, grated roots, salads, just the kind of stuff. You know, like I'll eat a big salad. I might make a blended soup. And then fill in the gaps with fruits. So I'm still eating quite a bit of fruit. I'd eat more if I could, you know, if I could manage to get hold of it. I would like to eat a lot more fruit, but it's just not always that practical. And I find that works. But I think initially, you know, for the first 3 or 4 years, I struggled to put weight on, and it sometimes felt quite harsh in my gut, this kind of thing. But over time, I've obviously adapted, and it feels perfectly fine now. But I've certainly heard of stories or even heard accounts of people who've, let's say several people have gone down what appears to be the same route, although you don't obviously know exactly what people are doing because what they tell you and what they do isn't always the same thing.
It's true.
But some people have just taken off, some people have not changed much, and some people have gotten into real trouble doing the same things.
So we all can expect different results from doing the same thing, just because we're different and we're coming from different places.
Absolutely. I mean, people talk about I don't know what the term is, species appropriate diet or something like that.
Yeah, species specific.
Yeah. Okay, so way back, I think that was a valid point to make. But I think there's such a spectrum of our individual variation now in what I'm going to call this post-symbiotic state we're in. The state of our gut, the state of our brain, the degrees of cerebral dominance or past history. There's a whole bunch of variables. So I think if we're going to move in that direction, and it ultimately can yield big improvements, which in principle I think it can, we almost are going to have to tailor our own diets, you know, and they're all going to be slightly different to start with. They might all end up in the same place, but the starting place might be quite different, and the time it takes might be quite different. And some people, you know, because of the state of the gut in particular, but other things, it may just not be appropriate. It may be too difficult. I mean, that might be quite extreme, but I think that might be the case for some people, particularly the older you get. It gets harder to make these kind of changes. A lot easier when you're young, I think. So the idea that there's a panacea in one diet, it sounds like there should be, and like I say, 200,000 years ago, that might have been the case. But I think now, you know, there's going to be a whole spectrum of approaches that move in the same direction, but at different speeds.
We spoke earlier about our origins being non-seasonal tropical forests, and I wanted to ask that, Do we have any clues as to what our ancient ancestors in these non-seasonal and tropical forests were actually eating? Because what we face today in the real world, in the supermarket, wherever we got our produce, isn't likely going to be supreme tropical exotic fruits that you find in these niche environments. Do we have any record of what could have been around then, and is it still available today?
I'm not that knowledgeable on African flora. I've looked into it a bit. There's not as much written about it as I'd like, particularly with focus on fruits. But I think you can get a lot of clues. From our basic physiology. Like I say, there's the popular press that will tell you 100 different things. But our basic anatomy and physiology has clearly been massively influenced by our arboreal past and our fruit-eating symbiosis. That's not really in dispute in science. It's just how it's popularized and people have agendas and stuff. So there's a big clue there. We clearly, for a long time, ate a lot of fruit. I think that's a reasonable assumption anyway. And we can also get clues from existing forest-dwelling apes and so on. But again, I'm saying they've all gone through these forest crashes and they've had to adapt and change. So I think there are clues there, but I wouldn't want to be too absolute. But it would seem reasonable that if there's been a major drying, that there might not be the same fruit species as there once were. That's my suspicion. But certainly things like figs are always a massive favourite for primates. When the figs ripen, that's what the primates want to eat, and regardless of anything else, including, like people obsess a bit about, oh well, some primates hunt like the chimps, and well, yes, and it seems more cultural. It's mostly the males and the dominant males. They do share a bit of it out, and it's not a big part of the diet. But even then, if the figs are in season, that's what they want to eat. So I think figs probably were, quite a favourite. Then there's, I sort of grew up on the idea that, oh yeah, well, it's difficult in the tropics because the fruit's hard and it's dry and it's not very tasty and it's not the fruit we have today. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, particularly in the seasonal forests, but deeper in the forest, particularly in some of the Asiatic, South American forests, but to a limited extent in Africa, although I think some of the fruits might have gone. There are bigger fruits. There are fruits that we looked at to think, wow, I mean, the jungle sop, I think, I can't remember its Latin name now. Mm-hmm. It's one of the biggest.
Soursop is the name they used.
Yeah, same idea, but even bigger. Massive, great big things. I think the bonobos, they'll pick them, go and hide them till they're ripe, and then go and eat them later. So and the bits I've read again, I have looked around, but obviously I've not gone out in the field and studied this stuff. But it certainly seems that bonobos can find quite a lot of fruit, and some of it's quite decent size and pulpy and this kind of thing. But I'm not too up on the species. But I guess it just comes back to what we have: a fruitarian or a frugivorous, physiology and anatomy. And I think whatever fruits we could find that we enjoyed, but I don't know what the species are. As I say, figs, jungle sop. There are other members of the cherry moya family, I think, in Africa, but I don't know how edible they are. I'd love to know. It's a gap in my kind of knowledge a little bit.
Because from what I've read, there is hundreds of varieties of figs. Then
oh yeah, a lot.
It's not just the one variety that the UK imports from Turkey. This is
we're
talking about wild figs here.
That's it's a domesticated form. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think a lot of wild tropical fruits are quite tough, and including a lot of figs. But again, we're talking about this particular niche where it's a more benign environment, there's more rainfall, and if you've got that symbiosis going on, the pressure on the plants is to produce bigger and more tempting fruits. So I think that, bearing in mind that's where a lot of the great apes seem to have evolved, I think there must have been an abundance or a significant amount of fruit, and some of that may have disappeared in these big droughts. So it's difficult to really be clear on that.
Should we put any attention onto specific types of fruits for neurodevelopment? For example, apples are not grapes, and which are not durians or jackfruit.
I think you'd have to take cues from what actually happened in the forest for millions of years that clearly worked. The thing is, I'm not sure what that means specifically. I would guess, I mean, most apes that eat a lot of fruit, they eat quite a lot of different species. I think diversity is good. If you see each tree as a pharmaceutical factory in its own right, way more complex. but each one's got a particular angle. I mean, there'll be a lot of generic chemicals that are similar or the same, but they'll all have their unique sort of elements. And generally it's good to get as much as possible unless there's a reason not to. So I think the wider range you can eat, the better. But then bearing in mind, so I think you mentioned apples. As far as I know, as far as I understand, that's a very recent addition to call it a significant fruit. It was a hard little, not much bigger than a berry in the not too distant past, and it's been rapidly cultivated by modern sort of horticultural when I say modern, probably over hundreds of years. So I'd be suspicious of those very recent. They may be fine. I'm not particularly attracted to apples. I'll eat them, but they're not. I think I'd lean towards the established fruits that grow in those regions if possible, or their relatives in families that maybe grow in slightly cooler climates, because obviously it's easier to access and easier for us to grow. And you can make assumptions in their genetic relationships, but you can't always be sure. So I think, like we mentioned, soursop, and then you've got cherry. They're all part of the same family, and some of them seem to have similar traits. That's a good guide, but you can't make that absolute distinction till you've done your homework, I guess. But yeah, a good diversity of fruit.
With a focus on perhaps the tropical fruits.
Well, I think they're the safest bet, but it's not always the most practical unless you're living there or growing it. So and like I say, I think there's a lot of generic qualities in fruit, even the temperate fruits. So, for example, berries, high latitude berries seem to have quite a lot of qualities. They're quite high in antioxidants. They're quite low glycemic. If you've got initial problems, it might be a good place to start with these low glycemic berries.
Like blueberries?
Blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, this kind of stuff. They're not remotely tropical, but they seem to have some good qualities. So again, they're not part of our evolutionary past, but they've got some qualities that might be worth bringing in as long as they don't cause you any trouble. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. Again, I think you've got to be quite flexible, and it's got to be tailored and horses for courses depending on what you need.
Are there any fruits that we should not eat? For example, many argue hybrids are not what we should be consuming, and they could be toxic, and that we should only stick to what is claimed to be natural. But the question is, what is really natural today?
Well, I think you've answered the question straight away, yes. How do you define natural? At some fundamental level, everything we do is natural because we're a product of the natural world. Building jets is natural. It's twisted and dysfunctional and self, but it's probably natural if you want to argue that point philosophically. But being more realistic, symbiosis by definition is us, or there's a selection process going on, and we've played a role in selecting the fruits that are considered natural, quite a big role, and certainly symbiotic species have. They've turned reproductive organs that didn't need to be big at all. They just needed to be big enough to grow the seed into these varying sized, swollen, they've swollen in response to symbiosis, and the chemical profile may have moved in this direction or that direction, and they've coloured up because of, colour vision's part of this symbiosis. So it's an artificial designation, in my opinion, and we've already played a massive role in selecting fruit for what it is, or certainly us and our relatives and so on. So I'm not worried in principle about modern selection and hybridization. Obviously, if there's pressures and it's going to a certain extreme, probably for commercial reasons, you might want to be suspicious. But just because there's a bit more sugar in fruit than the original apple, say, doesn't mean something similar hasn't gone on in the forest. It might have gone on for a bit longer. It might have taken a bit longer. We can speed things up now and create hybrids and stuff. But I think in terms of my concerns, that's a long way down the list. I think by the time that's at the top of the list to be worried about, things to be worried about, well, I'd be quite happy when that day comes around and we debate whether eating hybrid fruits are, I know there's quite a few people go on about it, but I don't think it's a major problem. And like I say, all the symbiotic fruit has been selected by symbionts like us. So it's like, well, all right, we've selected this fruit, now we shouldn't select fruit. All right, we might choose another. If we do it intelligently, and we're not trying to create a fruit that's got things in that are GMO'd and this and that, I don't really see a major problem if we're just sensible. But if there's a massive commercial pressure to create something that's got some weird chemical profile, and then stay away from it, because why wouldn't you?
You mentioned in your book how we are suffering from a chronic deficiency in essential fatty acids. Should our ideal diet be low in fat and focused on low fat tropical fruits, or is there a central role for EFAs in our times of chronic deficiency? What is the best source of these EFAs for our brain?
Yeah, I think it is a very important point. I think, again, in our culture, and even more widely than that, there's a general deficiency of essential fatty acids, and then usually quite a big imbalance, particularly in vegetarian, vegan, typical diets. People eat far too much omega-6, which is quite detrimental, not enough omega-3, and they're called essential because we can't make them, and they're part of the superstructure of cell walls and also our nervous system. Our neural systems is actually made of essential fatty acids, or a big part of it is, or derivatives of essential fatty acids. And the fact that we can't make them makes it all the more worrying that not only are we deficient, but we tend... these things are essential fatty acids are very volatile. In nature, they're almost always wrapped in layers of natural antioxidants and anti-inflammatories and so on, keep them protected. Well, we tend to strip that away and heat them in free oxygen. So we're massively oxidizing or pre-oxidizing our brain before we even built it, which is a really stupid thing to do, but here we are. There's probably a simple answer to that. So yeah, what we do with essential fatty acids, our deficiencies generally, the imbalance, and then the fact we heat them, is setting ourselves up immediately for a lot of problems, because we can't make them. That's it. We've damaged them, and then we build our brain from them, and then a lot of our problems in Western culture and Western diet is exactly that: too many free radicals, too much oxidization, and no protection. To try and correct that, the human brain is unusually large for a body size, and it's, fat's a high percentage of what it's made from. I think I would personally suggest we do quite a bit of essential fat restoration before going just on the fruits, because it's such an integral part of our whole system. I'm not talking about a high fat diet, but I'm talking about a quality fat diet leaning towards omega-3s, and being aware that our own natural ability to assimilate them and process them can easily be impaired by other poor things in our life, diet, other dietary elements, or alcohol or smoking. We do have a system to build our brain from essential fatty acids, but it's kind of on the edge because it's such a bloody big thing to build. And I think a lot of it's stored through the generations. Women will store fat before they're pregnant, and that's, like, to try and build this thing so quickly, it's like, oh my god, where are you going to get the fats from? But if you build it up through the generation, then some of that can be brought into the fetus, and that's how these kind of demands are ironed out. But where do you get them from? Well, they do exist in the kind of typical frugivorous diet anyway, but not in large quantities. But interestingly enough, and as far as I know, figs, a lot of tropical figs have edible seeds, and it's part of the symbiotic relationship. It's not just the fruit. Some plants are quite happy if you eat some of the seeds. It's nutritious as long as some of them make it through. Doesn't matter. And figs, I think in particular, have a really good balance of omega fatty acids, omega-3 and 6. So eating figs, seeded figs, tropical figs, that would be a good natural source. That's probably where we got quite a lot of our essential fatty acids from. Today, where else you get them from? Well, if you think you're deficient, or it's good to kind of try and retrofit and provide better quality fats, which I say is a good thing to do to start with, then you'd probably be looking at things like chia seed, hemp seed, maybe flax seed, these kind of things, and trying to get your system detoxified and clean, so your own essential fatty acid processing and conversion can do its job. So yeah, I think it's important, and I definitely wouldn't suggest ignoring that and just going straight on the fruits. I'd say build some fatty acid restoration into certainly your initial regime, and even a maintenance diet, because it's so central to our brain and our nervous system.
And where does coconut meat, avocado and durian sit on that bench of essential fatty acids? Are they good sources as well, or?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. Certainly, avocado has essential fatty acids, but I think they lean towards omega-6, which has its place. But our ancestral diet was almost certainly about a 1-to-1 ratio, whereas we've mostly eaten far too much 6, 5-to-1, 10-to-1, 20-to-1, and in that ratio it becomes not toxic but very detrimental. So in terms of correcting that, I think initially you lean to omega-3s. So things like avocados wouldn't be a good idea unless you overbalance them with something else that was high in omega-3s. As for durian and coconut, I'm not sure about coconut. I don't know if it has any essential fatty acids in. I don't recall, and if it does, it's certainly not omega-3 in any quantity. And durian, again, I don't know I know it's quite fat, and there's different kinds of fat, and some of them will be, the fact that orangutans love durian, to me, is always a good indicator. You can't totally make a decision based on that, but looking at what other things they're eating, I don't know what essential fatty acids it's had. I know it's a very fatty, and it's got a lot of good sulfurous compounds in, which are good for brain development and so on. But natural foods or natural fruits with omega-3s in quantity, figs are the only one.
How about passion fruit, for example, as well?
I don't know. I mean, in passion fruit, I think it's a South American plant. The core of what we co-evolved with is in Africa, but it might be a lot less than they used to be.
What actions in the world can real people in the real lives take today? Can they straight away just start eating fruits, or is there anything we have to caution around changing diet?
Yeah, well, I think we've covered quite a bit of this in terms of gut flora and neuroassimilation system. I don't think we're not, in my opinion, specialist symbiotic fruit eaters anymore. We're a long way from it physiologically. So I think to me it would be a case of wherever you're at, and people are at all different stages, eating a lot of junk food, eating a lot of meat, eating a lot of this, and depending on the state of your gut, slowly building in more and more over time, but just taking your time. I think in the UK the government had this 5-a-day thing going on for, I don't know if it's still a thing. Well, that's not the worst place to start. If you only eat one portion a day, eat 2, eat 3, and just slowly build it up and give it time.
And this could be several years?
Depends on your system and your age. Some people, it can be very quick. Some people can take a long time, and some people it never really seems to fully work, and I think we've got to allow for that. As I say, I don't think there's a magic wand to wave here. I think some people's physiology, one of the ironies is if this post-symbiotic reversion proposal that I'm developing and putting out is real, as our symbiotic brain reverts and becomes more of a primitive mammalian brain, it's kind of moving back towards our insectivorous past, which is kind of close to carnivore in a way. That's as close as anything. So the irony is, at least part of our brain is moving back towards something a bit closer to a meat eater in terms of its neuroassimilation, which is why I think we've got a problem and why it's hard to make these changes. The problem is if we stick with that, it's just going to get worse and worse. So it's how you turn that around when at least part of the equipment doesn't really deal with the kind of plant diet as well as it used to.
I was wondering, what do you think it means for a young person to be radical today, in today's society?
Wow, that's a complicated question. Radical. Well, I suppose I can start with, and without, it sounds critical, but I think most of what's considered radical today is pathetically not radical whatsoever. Buying the latest phone or staying out late at a nightclub or whatever goes on in youth culture. I don't even know anymore. That's what I can remember, the kind of stuff I might. There were phones around then, but I guess I'm obviously heavily slanted by my own work, but it seems increasing numbers of young people are really pissed off with what's going on, and so they should be, and if they're not, then they're seriously deluded. But I suppose I'd say, well, the most radical thing you can do is start doing your own digging and stop with the symptoms and look for the cause. I've got some ideas, and I invite anybody to check what I'm doing. Don't take my word for it. Really dig down. But I'm kind of riding on the coattails of our ancestors, because they said the same things, that there's something wrong with our mind. So I'd invite anybody to make that a significant priority in their life, because as we've already discussed, if there's a problem with our brain and our mind, we're never ever going to figure anything else out, ever. I wish it weren't that harsh, but things are getting worse. People knew about, well, way beyond this, but people were really concerned, I guess the hippies were always ahead of the curve, with recycling and deforestation. People have known about this for a long time, and has it got better? No, it's got a lot worse. And it's up to us. We're creating this mess. It's not creating itself. And obviously younger people are going to inherit what's left behind. So I suggest, they get as radical as they can. Dump the idiocy of the system telling them to become consuming robots and manufacturing robots. Get rid of all that and start actually finding out what's happening, and start trying to see what you can get out of this thing between your ears, because if it's telling you that you need good grades to get a good job, to buy a car, it's corrupted. There's something badly wrong with it, so I'd say start digging, start looking into this, and don't buy into the mainstream culture. That's the worst thing you can do, because it's proved itself for thousands of years to be a pathocracy. That's what our culture is. It's a pathocracy. It collapses, it rebuilds itself, collapses, and each time it's worse. And in the process, we suffer and we suffer and we suffer, and nobody has a really good time. Even people who are at the top of the pathocracy and they're creaming all the wealth off, they're still really not having a good time. It's born out of fear and control. Well, that's a horrible space to be in. So that would be my suggestion. It's hard to argue with that. I think all the ancient traditions are basically telling us to look in the mirror. That's where we have to start. It's easy to see the problems everywhere else. It's easy to see everybody else's dysfunction and delusion and so on. Much harder to see your own. But if you're willing to look, if you're willing to really open your eyes and almost take on board the possibility that there are problems, you start seeing them, and that's when you've got something to work with. While you're in la la land and thinking you're fine and it's everybody else, there's no chance whatsoever you're going to fix anything. So I think it's taking responsibility for ourselves, and by that I don't mean that in a selfish way, working together and supporting each other. But the work always starts, as you say, in the mirror.
Start with the man in the mirror.
And it's the hardest place to look, because sometimes we see things we don't want to see.
But that's how I made my change. I looked in the mirror and I realised that there's something that needs to change, and I have to be responsible for my own actions, and that's what led me to your work. So I just wanted to thank you for your time.